this program with Phyllis Bennis, who's become sort of like the princess of primers. That's your new title. She is one of those people that is, she's really like a walking encyclopedia. Whenever you have a question about issue that deal with international issues, that deal with the Middle East in particular, that deals with the United Nations, all you have to do is pick up the phone and get the answer, and she's faster than Google. She will give you the answer, and she'll give it to you. She'll give it to you in a way that's precise, concise, and easy to understand. And that's really the key, I think, behind Phyllis's brilliance, is that she's able to take a complicated issue and break it down into little bits and pieces and make it understandable to people like me. So please help me welcome here to the stage Phyllis Bennis from the Institute for Policy Studies. Princess of Primers, you like that, huh?
Not so much. Princess. It's not going to work.
Phyllis, we've sort of become kind of a tag team here. Phyllis had done this before on the Middle East, her Middle East primer book, which actually we've started a book club here. And the book club that we have is the first book club that we're sponsoring with Busboys and Poets. And the book club, we decided to pick Phyllis's book as the
other book.
The other one, which is the Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. Again, it's a primer. It's one of those books that has little questions, everything you wanted to know, but we're afraid to ask about the Middle East. And it has all the just all the answers in a concise, precise way for most lay people to be able to understand. This book here, Iran in the Crosshairs, is a fast, easy read, but really has so much information in here. And I know the issue of Iran has been coming up over and over again, and people are concerned about what's going on with Iran. It's been off the radar screen in so many ways because of the current election, but the issues are still as hot as ever. And lest we be surprised by another conflict that's taking place there, we wanted to bring Phyllis here to try to give us an overview of what's going on in Iran. So, Phyllis, give us the overview about what's going on in Iran. Is Iran really a threat to the United States?
Well, the short answer for that is no. But before I do that, let me just thank a couple of people and institutions, as it were. One is Andy, who's kind of both a person and an institution all by himself, who makes this extraordinary place accessible as part of our community, and with Dawn keeps the bookstore functioning, and forgot to mention that you can buy anything you want online from Busboys and Poets bookstore, just like Amazon.com. So then you really have no excuse. You can do it in your pajamas. I don't talk about other options the way you do. So that's the first one. And then I also want to thank the Iran team of IPS, who played a very important role in two things. One is putting this book together, which is no easy feat, and I'm completely incapable of doing it. But the other part of it was to help me figure out what are the questions that we need to answer, because frankly, in doing these little primers, the hardest part is figuring out what are the questions that people are actually asking. What questions would help sort this stuff out? And so that team of Seth Rahman and Eric Lever and Farah Hassan and John Cavanagh, who's not here, they're all sort of behind the cameras over here, played a great role in making this thing possible. So I want to thank you all for doing that. So now to the broader question about, is Iran a threat? The quick question to that is, no, it isn't. And in fact, nobody really claims that it is. That's the part that we have to sort of keep in mind. It's one of these everybody calm down first kind of questions, that the rhetoric around the issue of Iran, Iran's involvement in Iraq, Iran's so-called nuclear programs, all of it is so overheated rhetorically that people start out at a fever pitch. So the starting point is, oh my God, Iran is going to get nuclear weapons, and what are we going to do about it? That's like where you start. And so then you have to start with, let's everybody calm down. Let's look at what's real and what's rhetoric. So the rhetoric is Iran is a threat. Now, why is Iran a threat? No one claims that Iran has a nuclear weapon. The Bush administration doesn't claim it. Donald Rumsfeld doesn't claim it. Nobody claims it. Nobody claims right now that there is an active program in Iran to enrich uranium for the purpose of weaponization and building a nuclear weapon. Nobody says that either. The question that is not answered in a serious way is what would make Iran a threat? And there I think, ooh, that's a good idea. What a concept. See why I love this man? He protects me from that.
All right.
Maybe I'll sit over here.
Yeah. That's perfect right there.
There you go. The question of Iran as a threat emerges from three different sort of angles in the current crisis. One is the allegations about a nuclear weapon. Second is the allegation that Iran is involved in Iraq and is killing U.S. troops and therefore a threat. And the third is that Iran is the centerpiece for global terrorism and is building a Shia crescent of terrorist governments and terrorist forces that overall represent a threat to the United States. So if you take each of those claims one by one or as a group, you can see that they're simply not true. The first one, Iran as a nuclear threat. The language has been interesting because if you track, say, over the last couple of years, how the Bush administration has ratcheted down the requirements for what would make Iran a threat to the U.S., it's really extraordinary. For a while, they were claiming Iran's building a nuclear weapon and trying to sort of make us believe that it was practically done. They were practically loading it on the launch pads. You know, it's really imminent, and we have to move right away. And then when it, became clear from too many sources that that was simply there wasn't any basis for that one, they started ratcheting it down. So then Iran becomes, on the nuclear side, a danger because it has or might get the knowledge to build a nuclear weapon. So somehow Iran is a danger because of knowledge. Now put aside that this knowledge is generally available on the internet, that knowledge by itself is not a threat under any circumstances. It also takes no account of the legal questions about Iran's actual nuclear policies and its actual nuclear program. Because yes, Iran does have a nuclear program. It is enriching uranium. And it has enriched uranium apparently up to between 3 and 3.5%. That's about what you need for nuclear power. Now, personally, I wish Iran was not making any nuclear power plants. I wish the United States had stopped building nuclear power plants. But it is a huge loophole of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to which Iran was a signatory back when it started in 1968. It says that if you're not a nuclear weapons state, if you're signing the Non-Proliferation Treaty and agreeing never to get a nuclear weapon, that you get something in return. Because otherwise, why would you sign this treaty that says 5 other countries can have nuclear weapons and you can't? You're not going to do that out of the goodness of your heart. You're going to do that out of some sense of self-interest. So what's the self-interest? What do you get? Well, you basically get 2 things. One, you get the right to build, produce, buy, whatever, nuclear power, all you want, nuclear technology, for peaceful uses, for the production of nuclear energy. And you can get that technology wherever you want it. You can build your own, buy it from anybody else. That's all written into the treaty. That's in Article 4 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The second thing you get is a promise from the 5 nuclear weapons countries, which, what a coincidence, just happen to be the same 5 countries as the permanent members of the Security Council. You get a promise from them to move towards full and complete nuclear disarmament so that you can look forward to a moment sometime in the future when there won't be any more nuclear weapons and you won't be in this profoundly unbalanced situation. Well, it turns out that that one, Article 6 of the NPT, is absolutely ignored by the nuclear weapons countries, and they simply don't take it seriously. They've announced it. They have no intention of abiding by that. It's just not relevant. So Iran has the right to produce nuclear power. It has the right to enrich uranium. It has been denied what it was promised by the U.S. and its allies from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So in response to that, the U.S. position is simply, we don't deny necessarily that they have the right, we just don't trust them. And therefore, we're going to put enough pressure on the Security Council to impose sanctions that are based on the idea that Iran has to stop doing what they're allowed to do under the terms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And there's no basis in international law for this. The UN Charter doesn't say that the Security Council can take the role of denying to a country a right that is guaranteed it by a treaty. You know, that's not anywhere in the UN Charter. But nonetheless, the U.S. has put enough pressure on these countries that they are voting with the U.S. And that's where the nuclear one comes in. So then the second question is Iran a threat because it's controlling the situation in Iraq and is responsible for killing U.S. soldiers? Well, there's no question Iran and Iraq share a huge long border. They share a millennium-long history. They share a huge amount of things. They are not exactly the same people. There are religious differences between some Iranians and some Iraqis. You all know this, that Iran is predominantly Shia. So is Iraq. It's a higher percentage in Iran, but they both are predominantly Shia. Iraq is predominantly Shia Arab. Iran is predominantly Shia Persian, or you could put it the other way around. Iran is predominantly Persian, Iraq is predominantly Arab, except for the Kurds, who aren't Arabs. So there's, you know, everybody's very mixed up in that part of the world. But the border has always been a very open border in terms of trade, in terms of diplomacy, in terms of all kinds of things. And the question of, are there Iranians that are involved with some of the militias in Iraq? Probably there are. The problem is the U.S. hasn't produced any actual evidence of that. There have been Iranians arrested, and in fact, with great fanfare, George Bush not too long ago ordered the U.S. troops in Iraq to find and arrest any Iranian operatives. And they dutifully did what they were told. They went and arrested 5 Iranians in northern Iraq. But, oops, who were those 5 Iranians? They were diplomats who were there at the request of the Iraqi government and were actually accredited to the Iraqi government. They were in the process of opening a new consulate in Mosul. So that was the best the U.S. could do to come up with. They claimed that it was only through Iran that Iraq was able to produce these more advanced, explosive, penetrating weapons that have indeed created enormous levels of casualties for the U.S. occupation forces. And then it turned out, according to Patrick Coburn writing in the LA Times, that they have found in Iraq workshops creating these things with the same copper plates that are required for this. And he said it was very clear that anybody who knows how to do it can make it. The technology is very basic. They certainly don't need to be bringing these in from Iran. They're being produced indigenously in workshops all over Iraq. So then there's the third allegation, that Iran is a danger because it's the centerpiece of this Shia crescent in the region, and it's supporting terrorism all around the world. Now, I'm certainly not going to say that Iran has never supported military acts by guerrilla groups of various sorts that have carried out actually terrorist acts, what I consider to be a terrorist act, which is a military attack on a civilian target designed for political effect or political impact. I have no doubt that that's been true over the years. There is something slightly hypocritical for the U.S. of all governments to be the one standing in judgment, given that the U.S. has essentially written the book on how to support guerrilla organizations that carry out attacks on civilians, like its support for the Contras, just to pick one easy example throughout the 1980s. But be that as it may, that is probably true. But the problem is, again, the U.S. is relying on definitions that are not useful. For example, they support terrorism because they support Hezbollah and Hamas, the Palestinian Hamas organization in Gaza and the Lebanese organization Hezbollah. Now, the problem is, again, both of those organizations have, at various points, carried out actions that I would consider a terrorist attack, that have violated international law because they targeted civilians. However, that's not the main thing that those organizations do. Both of those organizations have won elections in their respective areas. Hamas, as you know, is the dominant force in the Palestinian parliament that was elected under the demand of the Bush administration when the Palestinians themselves didn't want to have the election yet. Hezbollah is almost the majority party. It's a minority of just a couple of percentage points in Lebanon, and both of them primarily function as social welfare organizations, providing the kinds of basic support for the poorest sectors of their respective communities. So the notion of what Iran is supporting or not supporting becomes a very problematic definition. Now, the final point of all this comes back to the even if issue. This isn't something I deal with directly in the book. I probably should have. But it's even if Iran started to build a nuclear weapon, not very likely, but if they did, even if they were supporting terrorism, the U.S. does not have the right to go in and militarily attack. That's a violation of far greater magnitude than any of those things. So we have to be very careful when it's our country making these kinds of accusations without real information, and where it ultimately comes back to the question of what then? Then can we do it? Because it's mostly about they're lying about the accusations, but there's still a very important even if answer that has to come next.
You mentioned about Iran's influence on Iraq, and just recently Ahmadinejad was in Iraq, and of course George Bush was in Iraq too. And the reporters, when George Bush goes to Iraq, they don't announce that he's coming, and they can't even write anything until the wheels have taken off the tarmac. So whereas with Ahmadinejad, we saw that there were weeks advance notice that he was going there, and he sort of went about his business pretty much as any head of state would in an open country, so to speak. What do you read in that? What should we read into that? Is that?
Well, I think it is quite significant, the distinction between the two. But I mean, Ahmadinejad did not, as far as I could tell from reading various pieces about it, he did not just go wandering on by himself through the marketplaces and the mosques of Iraq. He did have a huge,
outside the green zone.
But he didn't even start in the green zone, I don't think. He started in several mosques, and people came to him. What it did show, yes, he had a security guard with him. I'm sure it was quite an extensive one. But he did wander around in mosques and in marketplaces. And there was a sense that while everybody in Iraq is at risk, Ahmadinejad was not the kind of target that George Bush is, which is significant not only in terms of what it says about Iraqis' view of the U.S. occupation, something that is documented very well in the variety of polls that even the State Department has been taken, but that Ahmadinejad is seen as someone who, there may be enemies of Iran, there are plenty in Iraq, but he's not considered the kind of target that George Bush is. So it's a very interesting dynamic at play. I think that there is a great deal of resentment of the Iranian government among a number of forces in Iraq who resent this bigger, stronger, richer, larger neighbor playing a more dominant role in their society. But it doesn't translate into, and therefore we want to kill him. You know, so there's a very different view. Iranians and Iraqis have a long, long history together, and I think there's a problem when the U.S. at the governmental level and often the media level simply ignore that history.
You speak a lot in the book about what if we attack Iran and the sort of what happens the day after. You speak about the possibilities of Iran attacking different U.S. Military bases and all the other stuff that they can do. And it sort of paints a pretty bad doomsday scenario here. But frankly, in 1981, as you know, Israel attacked the nuclear reactor in the northern part of Iraq, and nothing much happened other than the fact that the nuclear program of Iraq was pretty much shut down. So to me, that seemed like a win. Why would this be any different?
Yeah, I think this is a very important question because I think the political situation around the whole issue of Iran having or not having a nuclear program exists in a very different world than did the Osirak reactor in 1981, which was being built by the French. Israel took the position that it was a strategic threat. We don't have to ask anybody anything. It was condemned at the time by the Reagan administration among everybody else in the world. It was condemned as an illegal act by not only the Reagan administration but the UN Security Council, led by the United States. I mean, it was a very different moment. The difference is they didn't act on that condemnation. There were no real consequences. Iraq did not respond militarily, partly because it was not a moment where Iraqi tensions were focused primarily on Israel or the United States. The U.S., of course, at that time was a huge backer of Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq. It was because of that relationship that the French were given the go-ahead to build the nuclear reactor at Osirak in Iraq. And the focus of tension in the region was on the rising Iran-Iraq war that had just begun about a year before. So it was a very different moment of history. Today, the question is, if the U.S. strikes Iran, and the Bush administration has made very clear that their view of it is, at least publicly, we're not talking about an invasion. We are, quote, we're only talking about a surgical strike against Iran's nuclear facilities. And then you have to take one step back and say, okay, you can call that a surgical strike if you want, but why do you think Iranians, at this moment of such great tension, are going to call it anything other than an act of war, which is what it precisely would be? Because Article 51 of the UN Charter, which documents what self-defense looks like, does not include anything the U.S. faces. What it would face is that if the U.S. attacked Iran, it would be a preventive attack, which is explicitly illegal in international law. And in that circumstance, Iran would then have the right of self-defense under Article 51. So then you have to look at, well, what could they do? And I'll tell you, about a year ago, I was meeting with some members of Congress who were asking this question. You know, they were looking for ways, these were the good guys, right? They were trying to figure out ways of preventing war in Iran. And when I said to them, you know, think about what would happen the day after Iran retaliates, because then you probably would start hearing about a U.S. invasion of Iran, even if the right troops are still tied up in Iraq. And they said, wait a minute, go back a minute. Iran could retaliate? What do you mean? And I was like, oh, my God. So I said, what do you mean? What do I mean? I mean, Iran's going to retaliate. What's going to happen the day after? They said, well, what could Iran do? So I started outlining, you know, they could attack U.S. troops in the Green Zone in Iraq. They could send Iranian troops to occupy southern Iraq. They could attack U.S. troop concentrations in Oman, in Qatar, in Kuwait, in half the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia. They could attack Israel. They could attack the Navy's Fifth Fleet off the coast of Bahrain, where they're based. They could sink a ship in the Strait of Hormuz. They could close the strait through which 45% of the world's oil flows on a daily basis. And they could do all that before breakfast. You know, this is a target-rich environment for Iran if that was their choice. I mean, that's what I'm not sure the U.S. sort of understands. Iran has been damaged by sanctions over the years, but it has not been shredded. It has not been destroyed the way Iraq was destroyed by sanctions, primarily because U.S. sanctions against Iran were never internationalized. They were never maintained by other countries on a global level the way the sanctions against Iraq were. And the result is Iran is still a very strong country. It's a very rich country, has lots of problems, lots of social problems, problems that Ahmadinejad, among other things, is trying to divert attention from by focusing on how he's getting attacked internationally. But Iran is not Iraq on that level. And it's disastrous that I think that is not widely enough known in Washington.
Now, do you think if let's say, Iran was to attack Israel as a retaliation, do you think Israel would use the Sanson option, the nuclear option? And what would that do to the region? I mean, Iran doesn't have nuclear power right now, so they can't really fight, you know, in the same way.
No one can fight a nuclear war.
Yeah.
Having a nuclear weapon to respond is not a viable option. I like to think that in Israel, people would understand how devastating it would be for their own population if they're not capable of understanding what it would mean for people elsewhere in the region. Certainly the countries there are too close together to risk a nuclear attack in terms of how fallout spreads, what happens when you make a mistake. You know, I mean, the risk is just so impossibly high. But on the other hand, we've seen in this country how an ideologically driven government can operate in the face of absolutely clear evidence against what they're claiming, solely on the basis of an ideological drive that says, no matter what the evidence tells us, democracy is what the Middle East wants. Democracy as defined by the United States is how people in the Middle East define it, and people in Iraq will welcome us with rice and flowers, and we will bring peace, democracy, and joy to all living things. The only way you can believe that and operate off of it is if you're not, it's not about not knowing. They knew. It was that what they knew didn't matter. They were driven by ideology. And the ideological drive in Israel is as powerful or more so among the ruling forces than the ideological drive in the White House. So it's a very dangerous reality that Israel could make incredibly dangerous decisions.
So it's there.
It's there.
You know, I want to ask you just a couple more questions and then open it up for a conversation with the audience here. For those of us who are concerned about the possibility of war in Iran, what are the options here in this country for us to do? Do we lobby Congress? Do we, have teach-ins? What is it that you think is the best way to use the energy of the people that are opposed to this kind of nonsense?
I think it's all of the above. I think that one thing that's important is to recognize that the fact that the national intelligence estimate was made public that said very clearly, although they believed that Iran was building a nuclear weapon at some point in the future, that whatever they were doing stopped in 2003, that the weaponization stopped in 2003, that doesn't mean it's no longer a danger. We've seen it before. We saw it with Iraq when people said they're certainly not going to go to war, with the Security Council refusing to give them permission, with the whole world arrayed against them. They did anyway. So we can't rely on logic. We can't rely on political concerns. You know, keep in mind that it's been 50 years or more since neither the president nor the vice president was running for re-election. That is a very dangerous reality. I mean, we see that just today when President Bush announced he was sending the vice president, he's sending Dick Cheney to the Middle East to negotiate with the Israelis and the Palestinians. I mean, how sick is that? So, I mean, we can't...
At least he's not here, so there's that. Left the country.
Yeah, well, there's that. Okay, I'll give you that.
Look at the bright side.
Okay.
Darth Vader goes to the Middle
Darth
East.
Vader gives us a bright side. He leaves. But there's also, we have to look at a very wide range of what has to happen to prevent this from happening. So yes, we do have to mobilize in Congress. Now, Congress is just in the process of passing a terrible piece of legislation that's called something like the Iran Sanctions Enabling Act, which is sponsored by a wide range of senators, including one Senator Barack Obama, unfortunately.
And Hillary Clinton.
And Hillary Clinton, I believe. Is that right? I didn't see her name as a sponsor, but I'm sure she's eager to if she hasn't yet. That essentially is designed to enable, as the title says, and to protect states who want to initiate sanctions against Iran, meaning they want to negotiate divestment campaigns against any company doing business with any company that works in Iran. So it's a second-tier boycott that they're talking about. And it's going to be very interesting. And we see it right here in Washington, D.C. There is a parallel resolution, two resolutions that have been introduced to the City Council by Councilman Catania that call on the district to follow the lead of that Senate resolution and divest from any corporations that might do business with any company dealing with Iran. A very dangerous idea if we're serious about trying to prevent war rather than trying to build up the most hardcore extremist elements in both Iran and this country who will benefit from that kind of reaction. So there's a lot of work to be done. We need to pressure members of the City Council not to follow along on this crazy idea of sanctions against Iran. We need to push for the defeat of the Senate bill on sanctions. And we need to, most importantly, work at every level, at different levels of political power, whether it's city councils, whether it's mayors, whether it's state assemblies, state senate, governors, university presidents, anyone whose voice gets amplified and can amplify our voice, to discredit the idea, to delegitimize the idea, to undermine the idea that a military attack on Iran is somehow okay. We have to make it politically toxic to even talk about a military strike against Iran.
There are 3 members of the City Council who did not sign on to this resolution. Just to sort of clarify, Jim Graham being one of them, who's the City Council member for Ward 1, the ward we're in right now, and I believe it's Muriel Bowser, Ward 4, and Marion Berry did not sign on it.
That's right.
So those 3 did not sign for it. So everybody
call and
else,
thank them.
Everybody else.
And call the others and demand to know why.
Yeah.
What do they think will be the results of that campaign?
Yeah. Speaking of campaigns, and then we'll open it up here. Is there any daylight between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton as it comes to the situation in Iran, or even broader, the Middle East?
Well, it's long been a truism and in this country, and unfortunately it's not any different this year, that no one whose primary concern is about changing Middle East policy, particularly around Israel-Palestine, but also around Iran, can rarely find solace in the elections for president. Nobody ever ran for president and won being critical of U.S. military aid to Israel, which, for example, is coming up again in just the next couple of days. There's a hearing on Wednesday, which those of you who haven't heard about it yet should know that in the summer, the Congress passed the first effort to give Israel 25% more military aid, totaling $30 billion, $30 billion over the next 10 years in military aid, so that when we see the kind of slaughter of Palestinians that we saw last week, all of those attacks were carried out with U.S.-provided weapons. They were carried out with F-16s made by Boeing. They were carried out with Apache helicopters, TOW missiles. The house demolitions were carried out with Caterpillar armored bulldozers. All of these are produced in the United States and paid for with our tax money as part of the aid, the military aid to Israel that goes uncritically every year. So those of you who have ties with your member of Congress, you might, when you're talking to them about the Iran bill, raise also the question of military aid to Israel. On the question of the 2 candidates, certainly Barack Obama has indicated a broader willingness to hear from different voices.
Okay. All right, let's move on then. No, you just supported my candidate. You know, I got to.
I work for a nonprofit which is not allowed to endorse candidates. I'm only telling you where the various candidates stand. Barack Obama has clearly been more open-minded in being willing to talk and hear from more voices. He also has a history of being involved in community work in Chicago. He has had dinner with Edward Said at an Arab community event. There's an infamous picture, if you will, circulating on the web. But Barack Obama has gone to great lengths to distance himself from that past. He has congratulated the Security Council for refusing to pass a resolution condemning the Israeli attack that left somewhere between 125 and 131 Palestinians, half of them civilian and half of those children, dead in that 4-day blitz last week. Now, Hillary Clinton, of course, has a longer history of supporting military aid to continue uncritically, to support economic aid uncritically to Israel, of close ties with pro-Israeli lobbies around the country, and close ties with Israeli officials, dating from her years in the White House as First Lady. So she has a longer history of those ties. On the question of the Iraq war, both of them use the rhetoric of we have to end the war in Iraq. Both of them would leave somewhere between 35 and 65,000 troops behind when they pull out what they identify as the combat troops and leave people in place for a number of specific jobs that range from training the Iraqi military, training them to do what exactly is not clear, that would be there to protect the 5,000-person staff of the new U.S. embassy that's being built, that would continue to carry out counterinsurgency operations, that would be there in case of further violence in the future, a whole range of subjects. So both of them would leave behind tens of thousands of troops. On Iran, both of them have said that no option can be taken off the table. Barack Obama has distinguished himself from Hillary Clinton by saying he would immediately open negotiations with the government of Iran without preconditions, which is precisely what's needed. Hillary Clinton has refused to do that, has said that negotiations without preconditions would be a reward and that Iran should not be rewarded. But both of them would keep the military option on the table.
I think I would urge you to purchase the book. It is available for sale in our bookstore. And Phyllis will be here for a little while to sign the book. And any questions that you may not even have thought of will be in here.